So it may seem that in order to make progress in the science of consciousness, we need detailed theories, detailed in the sense that they enable specific predictions about the neural details underlying, neural mechanisms underlying consciousness in human beings and other animals. But in order to gain a general understanding of consciousness and to transfer these insights to artificial systems, it seems we also need minimal models that abstract away from the underlying neural mechanisms. And I don't see these approaches as opposing each other, but more as complementary, as hopefully will become clear during the talk. So this is a plan. Yesterday in Lucia's talk and in Alex's talk, we heard that the desideratum on theories of consciousness is that they enable empirically testable predictions. And the challenge for some of these theories is how to apply these insights to non-human systems, including artificial systems. And one suggested solution that I want to explore here is to focus on minimal models of consciousness that abstract away from the neuromechanistic details. And I consider 3 examples of minimal models. The first is a type of minimal model, minimal unifying models, expected float entropy minimization, and the conscious Turing machine. And we'll hear more about the conscious Turing machine in the afternoon by Lenore and Blum. And then I want to consider how can minimal models facilitate a general understanding of consciousness. What are the roles that minimal models can play here? And what are challenges for minimal model explanations of consciousness? Okay, so here, by minimal model, I mean a minimal idealized model that focuses on core factors contributing to a type of feature of consciousness. In particular, models that extract away from underlying mechanistic details. We can contrast this with the notion of minimal phenomenal experience. So a minimal model of consciousness need not be a model of the simplest form of conscious experience. And we can also contrast it with the project of finding minimal markers of consciousness, which would involve finding sufficient criteria for the description of consciousness while making minimal theoretical assumptions. But minimal models, as I understand them here, need not focus on sufficient, but on necessary conditions. So this is one important class of minimal models that I want to focus on. Minimal models that specify necessary conditions as opposed to necessary and sufficient conditions for consciousness. And such models can be minimal unifying models, if they highlight assumptions that different theories have in common, which does not require that there be a consensus among all theories of consciousness, or they can be unifying if they highlight necessary conditions that are entailed by different functions of consciousness. Okay, but what's important for this talk is that one important sense of minimality here is that they only focus on necessary conditions for consciousness. An example is expected float entropy minimization developed by Jonathan Mason. So Jonathan is interested in a feature of consciousness that is a form of phenomenal unity. Consciousness is very smooth, as continuous as possible and free of unnecessary abrupt transitions, pops and crackles and so on. And Jonathan analyzes this as follows. Consciousness is given by some form of minimum expected entropy interpretation of system states, and it defines this formally. This is an abstract model of a necessary feature of consciousness, and in this sense, an example of a minimal model of consciousness. Another example is the conscious Turing machine. It's a computer science, not an engineering perspective on consciousness. The Norton manual are not looking for a model of the brain, but for a simple model of consciousness. And one goal is to provide high-level explanations of consciousness. So we already see when we consider these 2 examples that there are different roles, possible roles for minimal models, and one might be to provide high-level explanations. But what does it take to explain consciousness in the first place? So from a very general point of view, you have to specify an explanandum, give a description of a global state feature or phenomenon associated with consciousness, and then provide an explanation of this, which specifies causal factors that contribute to the phenomenon of interest. So this will be a causal explanation. But when it comes to consciousness, there's another peculiar feature. So often you don't have a ready-made explanandum, as it were, but only a puzzling description of a state or feature of consciousness, something that you need to analyze in order to understand what the target feature is in the first place. So with respect to consciousness, I think Kobe nicely highlighted that in his talk, that part of explaining consciousness involves defining what consciousness is. So I don't view these projects of analyzing features of consciousness and explaining them as separate projects, and you don't have to start with an analysis and then provide the explanations. So I view this more as a maybe a continuum, and it may also be possible to start with some explanation, and this might then give you some kind of definition of some features of consciousness. But just to illustrate this, consider temporal consciousness as an example. Here we find a puzzling statement. I experience two events as present but also as non-simultaneous. So consider two events that succeed each other, two claps that are very closely succeeding each other in time. So you perceive them as distinct successive events, but at the same time you also experience them at once, not first this event and then after some time the other event, but somehow they're both present in consciousness. There are different models of how to make sense of this. One is inspired by, or goes back to Husserl, according to which conscious experience has a tripartite structure involving a retention of the recent past, a primary impression of what's going on right now, and a retention of the near future. And one version of this idea can be found in Rick Brush's account of temporal perception, according to which the brain computes a trajectory estimate, which so an estimate of what's going on at different times. So what's going on in the very recent past, what's going on right now, and a prediction of what will be happening in the very near future. And this is all on the order of around 200 milliseconds, so it's a very, very near future and the very, very recent past. Okay, and we can relate this to mass levels of description. So the trajectory estimate would be at the at the computational level, and we can one can provide an algorithmic description. So how is this estimate computed? This might, in this case, involve a Kalman filter, and then one can look at how this is realized by the brain by specifying the neural mechanisms that actually perform these computations. And now there's one traditional interpretation of these levels, according to which the computational and the algorithmic levels are kind of autonomous from the implementational level. So in computational psychology, according to this idea, you only have to specify what it's done and how it's done computationally and algorithmically, and then you have an explanation of the phenomenon, and how it's implemented in the brain doesn't give you any new explanatory insight. So this would be one way in which a minimal model that only focuses on these high-level properties provides an explanation of the phenomenon. But things are, of course, not this simple, so which again we can illustrate with Brush's account and the example of temporal perception. So, as I said, there are different ways of making sense of these statements about temporal perception, and so Husserl's account would be intentional account, and there are other possible accounts like extensionalist accounts, according to which conscious experience itself is extended in time. So when you're experiencing a succession of events, you're having a succession of conscious experiences, and that's why you're experiencing this succession. And a historical precursor of this idea is can be found in the work of William Stern, according to which there's a temporally extended presence time. And now, crucially, there's a recent account by Matthew Piper, who, based on research on the neural mechanisms underlying different phenomena of temporal perception, argues that the brain integrates information over time via reentrant oscillatory multiplexing, and uses this to argue for an extensionalist model of temporal perception, which is in opposition to Rush's analysis of an account of temporal perception. So this, regardless of how you resolve this particular debate, I think it nicely illustrates that constraints from neural mechanisms are relevant to explaining phenomena associated with consciousness. Okay, now if we briefly sum this up, there are some different possible roles for minimal models of consciousness. On the one hand, they can provide an analysis of certain puzzling descriptions, and expected flow entropy minimization would be one example, analyzing form of phenomenal unity. But then there's a further question, can there really be minimal model explanations? So can the conscious Turing machine really provide an explanation, or does this suggest that you have to go down to the neural mechanisms in order to provide an explanation? And indeed, there are some people like Gualtiero Piccinini who want to argue something like that. So if you want to provide a causal explanation and focus on high-level models, you get at most how possibly explanations, how something could be done by the brain, some ways in which a capacity could be realized. But you have to investigate the neural mechanisms to determine whether the actual explanation has been found, and in the end you might need a multi-level mechanistic explanation. Okay, in general, I think there are two challenges for minimal model explanation. One is the justification challenge. So absent constraints from neural implementation, what justifies alleged explanations provided by a minimal model? And there's the explanation challenge. Given the generality of the model, what new insights about consciousness does the model provide? So let's look at the conscious Turing machine again. One important aspect is that it's inspired, among others, by the global workspace theory, and goes to provide high-level explanations of consciousness that draw confirmation from consistencies with the neuroscience literature at a high level. So this already may give us a hint as to how such a model, such explanations can be justified, namely by reference to a theory that already has some empirical support. So maybe if you have a theory that enables predictions, and to the extent that these are confirmed by empirical data, this provides justification for the theories such as global workspace theory. And if we abstract away from such a theory by developing a minimal model such as a conscious Turing machine, the justification, the confirmation is inherited from the theory from which it's inspired. Okay, and then there's another idea, which would be that there are some details that are kind of arbitrary. So as we see in the afternoon, the conscious Turing machine is defined by the 7 tuple, and so on. Other formats may be just as good. Some format had to be chosen. And another aspect, the binary uptree, we'll hear more about this in the afternoon. I hope it could be more generally be a k-array tree. The uptree is made binary because binary is both simple and sufficient, and because a choice between two chunks at a node is slightly simpler to describe. So there seem to be some choices that are kind of arbitrary, and so it really doesn't matter whether the model is specified in this way or that way, and if it doesn't matter, then you don't have to provide a justification for why the model is formulated in this way rather than in that way. Okay, so these are two possible replies to the justification challenge. On one hand, you inherit justification from a more detailed theory that has some empirical support. But then the question is, what new insight, what new explanatory insight does the minimal model provide if it's just, as it were, an abstract version of the detailed theory? And another reply would be that there's no justification needed for some of the details because it doesn't matter how you specify it. But then the question is, if it's to some extent arbitrary, whether the model is formulated in this way or that way, how can that be explanatorily relevant? Okay, so this brings us to the explanation challenge. So what are new explanatory insights? According to Lenore and Manu, no other global workspace-related theory gives a substantive idea how processes might decide among themselves what information to send to the stage. So the one thing the conscious Turing machine seems to provide is an algorithm that is explicit for the specification of how the computation between different chunks that compete for access to the global workspace, how this competition is resolved. And one might reply that this may only be a how possibly explanation. So this would be one possible way in which the computation is resolved. But on the other hand, if there's no existing proposal how it's done, then even having just a possible algorithm is already some progress in this respect. So how possibly explanations can be just fine in some cases. Okay, then another possible reply is that conscious Turing machine makes it possible to quantify and prove complexity constraints on the global workspace, maybe providing a purely mathematical explanation of some features. So I would be really interested in hearing what Lenore and Manuel think about this. And another aspect is that maybe some explanatory insights are not new, but they are generalized by showing that certain features are not contingent on the neural details, but extend to other systems as well that have very different underlying mechanisms. And this might also extend to high-level explanation of blindsight, sleep, pain, pleasure, and so on, provided by the conscious machine. Okay, so there are two possible replies to the justification challenge that I mentioned. One is that justification is inherited, as it were, from a more detailed theory, or that no justification is needed due to abstraction. This both raises the explanation challenge, well, then what new explanatory insights are provided. And so on the one hand, there might be new or possibly explanations, and insights can be generalized. And maybe there are some purely mathematical insights or mathematical explanations. Okay, so to sum up, minimal models of consciousness abstract away from neural mechanistic details and forms a general understanding of consciousness. There are at least two roles for minimal models in understanding consciousness. One is analyzing types of features of consciousness. The second is providing high-level explanations. Two challenges we talked about, justification and explanation, and the suggested solution is that reference to mechanistic details may be necessary for certain justifications, but the explanatorily relevant features might still be picked out by minimal models at a high level. Thank you for your attention.